Last week, we began our conversation with Bibi Belford and Tracy LeGrand about middle grade books and social issues. We learned how books can support our understanding about history and social stories and bring awareness about the lives of those who are like us and can help expand our viewpoint into seeing life differently. We talked about windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors. We talked about the dangers of a single story, and we talked about sensitivity. So, let's talk about it some more.
That sounds good.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
We're excited again to have Tracy and Bibi with us. And Tracy, what are some strategies that teachers can use to integrate literature and social and current events? I know Bibi mentioned a couple, but let's explore that a little bit more.
First of all, like Bibi mentioned, of course, as teachers, we always have to look at what our standards are that we're expected to teach at each grade level. So one of my favorites for social studies in our state was fifth grade, because we start with Reconstruction and move to the present day. And so it's a little bit easier to make some personal connections with students. A lot of them have relatives that might remember a little further back and into units that we would be studying during the year and everything. One of the things that we tried to do was to weave together things like primary sources, songs from different eras, looking at what was important to people at that time, looking at historical fiction, what did this look like in everyday life for people, weaving together like some personal and family histories, if there are some stories that, have been passed down through their families about ancestors or even, relatives who are still living. And then looking at current events. I used to use a lot the website newsela.com. The cool thing about that is it takes current event issues, articles, and adjust the readability for students. And you can even adjust it even on the website. Like it'll have the same article with 4 or 5 different reading levels. So a lot of times we would use that and say, for example, I remember the last year that I taught fifth grade, we were studying the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution and looking at the 14th Amendment. And gosh, citizenship, I mean, it's a question that we're still debating today. So, we pulled in some articles from News ELA. Everybody talked about what they thought. We had class debates. We did some writing. And so, those kinds of things of bringing all those different sources and different perspectives together, I think were helpful.
How about you, Bibi?
I think that's great. I love that Tracy talked about Newsela, because that's what I was going to say too, is pairing those informational and non-narrative texts with the historical fiction that you're reading to get that mileage out of being able to compare and contrast what's happening in the story and what's really happened in the past or even is happening today. Being flexible, following the students' interests. It's hard sometimes to do that, but if they get going on a tangent and just let them go, because kids come up with the best stuff and they can really design really a lot of their own curriculum that way. I volunteer in a third grade right now. One of our literature standards is getting information from text features and photographs and using that information to increase our understanding of the story. And we're using a book right now called Knock Knock, about a boy whose dad always used to tell him knock-knock jokes, but one day his dad just disappeared out of his life. And it's a really rich in photographs, and the art in the book is like just beautiful. And there's not a lot of words, but there's enough that are difficult enough for third grade to use. Anyway, the kids are making so many connections and inferences in this book that during workstations we decided we needed to place an informational passage about mentors and how mentors can be substitute dads. And then they were still, just talking about how they were missing these people in their lives. So then they wrote about someone in their life that they missed. And they think that whole just integration of literature with this social event of missing African-American men in the community was very powerful for them.
Wow. So if you have a classroom and you have kids from a lot of different backgrounds in that same classroom, and you give them all the same historical novel to read, how are the kids from the African-American background, the white background, the Latinx background, the Asian American background, the kids with single parents, the adopted kids, the foster kids, the kids with gay parents, and so on and so forth. How are they all going to read that same piece of historical fiction and understand it differently?
Well, for me, I can relate to this as an author when I go visit talking about my books. And the difference I see is, and I don't know if it's fair for me to make this generalization because I'm from the majority culture, but when kids that are maybe a little bit more affluent and mostly white talk to me about like crossing the line, they'll say things like, wow, I didn't know Chicago had rice riots, or talking about another D for Didi. They'll say, that's really bad that her house burned down. But when kids of color are discussing the book with me or wanting to share with me, they say things like, yeah, that's the way it is. That happened to me. That's what my grandma told me about. I had an uncle whose trailer burned down. I have a grandma who's not here legally. So they more make the connection. So it's almost like they're looking from within at the story, and the kids that have never experienced those things are looking from without. But they still are able to discuss it and have great communication. It's almost like a little, like we talked about, windows and mirrors, but it's almost like they're able to look through that window when they're discussing it with their friends.
That's interesting to me. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. What do you think, Tracy?
Well, I just think pretty much everybody is going to read any text through the lens of their own experience. So depending on the level of your life experience, not the level, because I don't mean it in a hierarchical kind of way, but maybe the extent of your life experience and what you've been through or seen your family members or friends go through, you frame what you're reading in what you understand. So I think that goes right back to Bibi's point about, the students who have experienced this. Yep, that's the way it is. And if you haven't experienced it, it's going to be something new for you.
I had people beta read my book or, be authenticity readers for my book. And one of the authenticity readers was an undocumented girl from Mexico. She's a college student. And she agreed to read it and make sure that nothing in another D for Didi was culturally inappropriate. And she said, it was just so touching to me because what she said, I wanted to first thank you for the plot because it is something that hits close to home. And I loved reading about Didi's journey. The content is accurate and not offensive. It is represented accurately. I definitely cried when Didi's dad called her. And, I never put that in there for somebody to cry at that part, and I never would have thought about it. But in her perspective, from her life, that was so touching to her. And then another person that I had read it was a guy named Josh, who was also a college student, and he's a non-normative college student, and he's of a minority race, and he uses a wheelchair, and he's adopted. So he read that book with a completely different perspective than Judith. And again, he just said, I want to thank you so much for writing this book and for accurately representing what it's like living with different capabilities, more than what is considered the norm in society. I so graciously appreciate it, more than you'll ever know. So I just think that from kids who are in those same positions as Judith and Josh would have a completely different response to reading books with social issues than kids who are in a different place. And maybe those kids are going through other things in their lives, that they really have to become empathetic to each other and what they're facing in their lives. So.
Wow, I really appreciate that from both of you, because I do think then this does open up potential cans of worms. I'm going back as a little third grader myself and thinking about a task that I was asked to do. And I had a pretty traumatic experience, and I really couldn't do the task because I couldn't get through my own narrative in order to participate in this task. And I absolutely could relate to maybe some of the stories that you're sharing, Bibi. So, Tracy, what are some of the ways that we can avoid some of these pitfalls? Because there is, as Bibi shared, the need for sensitivity when we talk about things like that.
Yeah. And I'm glad that she brought that up because I do think that's so important. I think for one thing, we need to know our students. We need to know as much as we can about some of those things that they've been through. Of course, a lot of it's going to be very private that we don't know. And sometimes we might step into those pitfalls unwittingly. But I just think we have to try to be sensitive ourselves, to what they're going through. I think giving them choices of what to read is really important. That's one of the reasons why I tried to collect different books about the same topic that are treated and approached in different ways, and maybe let them have some choices, not every single choice, but some. I just think, and I know this is so hard because teachers have so much on their plates, but I think we have to be well-read in what's current in children, middle grades, young adult fiction, because a lot of times the books that we cherish from our childhoods aren't going to apply anymore. They're not as relevant. They don't quite speak to today's reality. So we have to make sure that we're keeping up with what's new, what's out there, and kind of be well-read ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that. How about you, Bibi?
I think that's so true that our history as readers, well, when we were young, the palette is changing, and like now books are being challenged. Books like Little House on the Prairie, they're being scrutinized for their historical representation. So I think it's really important to choose books that are vetted carefully for our students. Books with parents and teachers, they have to read the reviews and they have to keep current in their own reading. You don't have to read the whole book, but you can look at Publishers Weekly or newspaper book sections that talk about books. And two, a deep repertoire of just what history is going on. I mean, I know after the Little House on the Prairie books were being scrutinized and that whole, keg of worms, or what did you call it, a can of worms?
Yeah.
Debbie Reese, who's very vocal about representing history correctly of our own country, pleads for everyone to read more history. And many of us need to read more history. Some of the books that are mostly are challenged right now are dealing with a different version of history than some of us know. So I think that that's important, just to keep yourself, parents and teachers and librarians, keep yourself just inundated with what's out there and what you think is appropriate for your classroom at any given time.
So when a book portrays a time period in history or maybe a different culture that you're not familiar with, how do you know if that's accurate or not? How do you know when you're inadvertently reinforcing a stereotype and when you're introducing a younger reader to a window?
Well, this is really, really hard for me. I want to say that Crossing the Line went through like maybe 30 different edits, as well as revisions. And some of them were for that very reason. And that's one of the reasons that now most authors always have to have authenticity. Most publishers will require it. And my authenticity readers, I can give you an example of something that I just thought was, the boys were around a campfire, and I had the boys who were the immigrants from the South singing a song that they would have sung while they picked cotton in the South. And one of my authenticity readers said she took offense at that. And she said nobody that ever picked cotton in the South would be singing a song about it while they're trying to relax around the campfire. And, I would have never, ever thought that. So, of course, I took that song out and I changed it to Billy singing a song about a song that his dad had sung in Ireland and that he had shared with the family. When I wrote Another D for Dee Dee, my first draft, my editor said absolutely not and refused to even look at it until it wasn't even a draft, it was just my pitch. And she said, I will not read the synopsis until you have gone to all these diversity websites and gotten yourself a different perspective, because I was coming at it from a white savior perspective. So I think it's really important to think about those things when you're writing and when you're choosing books. I know there's a project, I think it's called the Visibility Project, and it's dedicated to policing what's being written today. So if you're concerned about a book and you went into it, you could kind of look at, there's like 5 rules that you have to look at. And if a book is writing about another culture that the author is not part of, then you have to be very, very careful and look carefully at that book and Google like that author and their other books and the tradition of why they write. It's hard for people of the majority culture right now, like me, to get books published. It's a challenge because we're really going, and the pendulum is swinging to really diverse books and diverse authors, which it should. There's a huge discrepancy between the number of books that are written by people who are not of color and people who are of color. And we need to, if we want to get books out there, we've got to have more books written by people who have that authentic voice. Another thing is illustrations. So be careful, looking at those illustrations. There was Cat in the Hat now is coming under scrutiny because the character sort of looks like a blackface minstrel character. And now Dr. Seuss is they're looking at that, and this is all news to me. So, the other thing is the kind of language that's being used, if there are languages at all mocking a culture. A book I loved reading when I was reading to kindergartners was Skippy John Jones, and now that book is being looked at for mocking the language of Latin people. And also another one is power relationships are off in the book, where the relationships between the characters is either explicitly or subtly, where one character is always the power in making the choices. And they should be balanced. And then also books that are just absolutely lies about the way the history used to be, which would be like The Little House on the Prairie, which is kind of sad when you think about these books are part of the books I grew up loving, but now we're, growing and changing in what we know, and we have to change with the times. That was a lot to think about, wasn't it?
It is a lot to think
We're
about.
sitting here kind of mulling that over and digesting that. That was good, though. Thank you.
I heard Dr. Kim Parker speak at a Scholastic conference a long time ago. She was talking about diverse books. And she did have one perspective that I thought was really interesting. Of course, she was talking about authors speaking with their own voices, about their own cultures and everything. But she also talked about something that I thought was interesting. She said, not every book with African-American characters has to be about the civil rights movement. You can just have a group of characters that just go through life in a loving, supportive family, and things happen. And, she talked about honoring some of that as well. Some of the books that she was sharing, some of the picture books and stuff, were just the certain aspects were kind of incidental. It was just part of the fabric of the story, that this child in the story is of a minority culture, but, you can also connect with it on a more universal level. I just thought that was kind of an interesting point.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think Bibi shared a little bit about that it's not necessarily the issues, it's the strong characters. Yeah. And I appreciate it. So thinking about these strong characters, what are some middle grade fiction books that expose kids and adults to social issues? So I'm going to ask you, Tracy, first of all, give us a couple of good recommendations.
Oh, man, there's so many. I have a whole list here, and I'm trying to decide what to highlight. I am sort of obsessed with Jason Reynolds. I love him. And a lot of his books are written for older students, high school. But he does have some that are more middle grades. The Track series is geared a little bit for more for younger students, and As Brave as You. And he just has such an interesting story, so I love him. I've also really enjoyed Catherine Applegate and some of her books. Wish Tree was really, really interesting about, a Muslim family coming into a neighborhood. Crenshaw deals with homelessness. One and Only Ivan, just talking about the animals and how we treat them, and, the whole issue of, zoos and all those kinds of things. Home of the Brave, talking about immigration, refugees. She's got some really interesting books. And, oh gosh, I'm just looking over. C.C. Bell has a great story called El Defo, which is a graphic novel, and it's somewhat autobiographical. She talks about her experiences growing up as a deaf child and what that was like. And there are so many things in that story that when I've shared it with students that they were kind of like, gosh, I never would have thought how that might seem to a girl who's deaf. So she talked about in the story being heartbroken at her first sleepover when they turned the lights out and they kept whispering. And of course, she couldn't hear anything, nor could she read their lips because the lights were off, and the kids were like, gosh, I never would have thought of that. So it just kind of helped them to be a little bit more empathetic to and to consider, what someone else's perspective might be. Nikki Grimes always has some really great books, and I do have to give her a shout out because she sent me a whole box full of books for my students for free. So and lots of them were autographed, and so that was fun. The kids loved that. Jacqueline Woodson. I mean, oh my goodness, we just saw her speak. And she's amazing. There's just so many, but yeah, those are a few of my favorites.
How about you, Bibi?
Tracy and I, we could go to coffee and we could probably talk about books for hours.
Oh, yeah. Let's do it.
It's like, asking somebody who owns an ice cream store, which is your favorite flavor.
Right.
Some of the books, I have a lot of the same books as Tracy, but I'll try to give you the ones that are different and maybe about different things. Like socioeconomic differences is something that's, I think, a good social issue. Okay for Now by Gary Schmidt.
Oh, I love that book.
I really love that. It's a little older. And then my friend Beth Rabel, who writes the blurbs for my book, and I've written a couple for her, she's written Caleb and Kit, and that's about a little girl who's almost homeless, like kind of just abandoned and, just not taken well care of. And that's a really good one. And then she writes about A Blind Guide to Stinkville, which is about a girl with albinism, and her daughter deals with that and the intolerance that can happen when you have, you don't look like you're blind, but you really can't see very well. So that's another one. The Remarkable Journey of Coyote Sunrise deals with death and how a little girl is handling the death that has happened in her life. A lot of agents that I've approached, they don't like books about death and dying, but I think kids need to be exposed to that, again, being sensitive, but that's a good one. Parents in Prison, Bringing Me Back, and there's another book about parents in prison. I can't remember the name of it. It's really good, and I read it, but I can't remember it. And then The War That Saved My Life is historical fiction about a little girl who has a club foot in London, and her mother is so embarrassed about that club foot that it almost prevents Ada from being saved. So that's good. And then two really kind of different sorts of books about the Revolutionary War would be Chains, Forge, and Ashes, the trilogy by Laurie Halse, and then Anne Rinaldi, who writes. Hers are very weighty, so they're a really challenging read, but you have kids that can read all kinds of things, so I would say those are some of the ones that I've been reading lately. I try to read about 1 or 2 middle grade books a week, so keep myself abreast of what's happening.
Putting me to shame.
Well, I can recommend Canned and Crushed and Crossing the Line because I've read both of those. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your books?
Well, my website is bbelford.com, and all my books are on, of course, Amazon and whatever. So Canned and Crushed is the first one, and that's about a little guy named Sandro, who the boy that I modeled that character after was actually in my second grade classroom. And he did the things that Sandro did. He spit over the third floor railing. He had a comb that I thought was a switchblade, all kinds of fun things. So that was the first book that I wrote. And Sandro's dealing with a sister who has a heart problem and they don't have insurance. So the parents agree to take the little girl back to Mexico, and Sandro stays with his father, who can't go because he's undocumented and won't be able to come back home. My second book is Crossing the Line, and that's historical fiction set in 1919. This story is really just the story of friendship between two boys, two kind of unlikely friends who meet and build a raft, and then subsequently a tragedy happens with that story. And then the third one is Another D for Dee Dee, which is about Dee Dee, who has lots of D's in her life, one of which is diabetes. that she just discovers in 4th grade. And her father has disappeared right after Christmas, and they don't know where he is. And so she's working to acclimate herself to a new school, be accepted, battle the bully. And the boy that she becomes friends with is hearing impaired. He has cochlear implants, and she's fine being friends with him as long as they don't go to the same school. But when he transfers, she faces a big challenge of not wanting to be embarrassed by him and really having to learn what it means to be a good friend. So those are the 3 books that I've written.
Wonderful.
So what does the future look like for social issues in fiction and middle grade publishing?
My publisher right now, this is kind of a sad story. I have a sequel written to Canton Crushed, and I have another book that's written about the Pedro Pans that came here in between 1960 and 1963 and lived here from Cuba. They were unaccompanied children that we took care of while Cuba was undergoing its civil strife. Anyway, my publisher is no longer publishing children's fiction. So I'm in the search of an agent or someone to publish my books. So I think that historical fiction has kind of a hard road ahead of it. I know sales are up generally for fiction. A lot of those sales are driven by graphic novels and picture books. Sales are a little flat when it comes to fiction and historical fiction for middle grade novels. I'm hoping, though, that because most teachers don't have to use a basal reader, and that's a book with a compiled set of stories in it, they don't have to use that start to finish anymore. They can usually design their own curriculum and write their own units, and I'm hoping that that will help drive the market for more books about social issues, especially with historical fiction. So.
Does this mean you're being trusted with your own classroom, Tracy?
Well, I'm not sure I would go that far. But I do know, like Bibi said, the movement is going away from just that traditional reading textbook set in stone and all the kids reading the same stories and all that sort of thing. So we're trying to branch out, become more balanced in our literacy approach and meet the needs of each reader where they are and move them forward from there.
So we like to ask our guests in each episode to share a metaphor or analogy. And so, Tracy, what is a metaphor or analogy to help us connect social issues and learning?
Well, of course, we have already talked about the windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors that Rudine Sims Bishop has developed. But I also love the metaphor that Katie Kelly and Lester Laminack present in their just recently published book called Reading to Make a Difference. And they have said that books can be bridges. And so they kind of extend that metaphor and talk about how books, they can be a bridge between where a reader stands at the moment and just new ideas and viewpoints and perspectives that just they haven't even considered before. They can be bridges to other places, other points of view, other people groups. And then they help us connect our own worldview with that of others. I just think that illustrates the power of books to help us build a more global community. We don't see the world in those dualistic terms of good and bad, right and wrong, us and them, for us, against us, that kind of thing. It just helps us to bridge the gaps between ourselves and the rest of the world, and make us maybe a little bit more of a world citizen, I guess.
How about you, Bibi?
Well, I love Tracy's. I'm going to check out that book, Reading to Make a Difference. I'll have to check into that. It sounds great. So I looked at it in a little different light, and we happened to be at a nature center, and there was I hate snakes, and there was a snake under glass there that I could actually see and get close to. And I thought, when kids read in historical fiction or a book with social issues for the characters, I thought, it's sort of like studying that snake under glass. It's close enough, you can observe it and analyze it, but it's contained, so it's not too dangerous or too personal. And you can talk about the characters, you can be introspective about it, but there's no incrimination because you're talking about the characters and you're not talking about how you would relate to your neighbor. It's these characters in a book. And your responses then to racism or ableism are about those characters and how those characters are interacting and not yourself. And I thought, later, if I did see a snake in the wild, I could then observe and analyze that snake in a better light and maybe not be quite so afraid to deal with it. That would be a kid's making changes, you know, in their worldview or in their behavior that could affect our future. You know, it's sort of like, I live near the shed here, so, you know, going to the dolphin show and watching the dolphin show and hearing them talk about how dolphins have to, you know, the pollution in the water is affecting them, and then you going home and saying, okay, you know, I'm going to be careful now and not have as much pollution. I'm going to be careful when I go to the oceans. I'm not going to pollute. So I was sort of thinking of it in terms of like that personal kind of interaction. So
That's really good. I love the snake. I love the snake.
We were thinking maybe you were going with a garden when you started talking about the nature center, and we've had several analogies that go garden direction, but the snake is a new one.
I like that.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, very good. Wow. Well, we have so enjoyed our conversation with Bibi and Tracy. And, you know, when we think about social issues, when they're used correctly, fiction can introduce young readers to complex social issues and begin to shape their view of the world with more empathy than maybe just that straightforward textbook. And as Tracy said, it can be that bridge to develop a more global citizen. So we're really thankful for this opportunity to have this great conversation.
Yeah, and speaking of bridges, next week we're going to be talking about borders, crossing borders, how stories help us cross borders. And we'll have Samuel Parker, the author of the adult thriller novel Border's Son, and Mitali Perkins, author of a string of books, including You Bring the Distant Near, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. Samuel and Mitali will be sharing their ideas about how stories help create, reinforce, or cross borders between people and places. Don't forget to subscribe to the AfterwordPodcast.com and like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And see you next week. You are welcome to join me, Amy, and Samuel and Mitali Perkins around the table.